The desert world of Xylan stretched for miles in every direction. The ground was dry, cracked, and endless. The sun burned like a fire in the sky. The air shimmered with heat, and the sand moved like a living thing. Only the strongest could survive in such a place. And that was why the aliens laughed when they saw the human shelter. The aliens came from a proud race, tall and armored with shining scales. They had crossed many stars and built cities that touched the clouds. Their ships were made of metals, harder than stone. Their homes were high and filled with light. So when they landed on the desert world and saw what the human had built, they mocked it. It was a small shelter made of stone, metal, and sand. It looked rough, simple, and almost broken. It was not tall. It was not shiny. It was not grand. To the aliens, it looked like a joke. One alien laughed and said, "Is this the best humans can make? A box in the sand." Another added, "Our tents are stronger than this. Our shields are brighter than this." They laughed louder, their voices echoing in the hot air. A human stood nearby, silent. His name was Captain Reed. He was not tall compared to the aliens. He did not have shining scales or bright weapons. He wore simple clothes, dust already covering his boots. But his eyes were sharp, like someone who knew the desert better than the desert knew itself. Captain Reed said, "Do not laugh. This shelter is not for beauty. It is for survival." The alien smirked and waved his warning away. One of them tapped the wall of the shelter with a claw. "It will fall with the first strong wind," he said. Another kicked the sand at its base and said, "It will be buried in the first storm." But the human only shook his head. "You have not seen a real storm here," he said softly. "You think your shields will protect you, but you are wrong." The aliens ignored him. They set up their own camp nearby. Their tents stood tall, made of shining fabric with glowing poles. They raised energy shields above them to block the heat. They sat under the shields and laughed. They told each other stories about how weak humans were. And they pointed at the small shelter again and again, calling it a cave for animals. But far away, the desert was moving. The horizon shimmered darker than before. The sky bent with strange colors. The wind began to change its voice. It was no longer a soft hiss, but a low growl. Captain Reed looked up, his face calm but serious. He could feel it. The storm was coming. The aliens did not notice. They were busy enjoying their food and drinks under their glowing shields. They were busy mocking the humans' work. One alien shouted, "When the first breeze comes, the human will run inside his box." The others laughed. They did not see the wall of sand far away. They did not hear the roar hidden in the wind, Captain. Reed stepped closer to them. "You still have time," he said. "Bring your people inside. The storm is stronger than you believe." But the alien leader raised his head proudly. He had scales that glowed like gold under the sun. He was tall, his voice sharp and heavy. He said, "Human, your fear is loud, but your shelter is weak. Our shields will protect us. Our strength will carry us. We do not need your box of stone." Captain Reed looked at him without anger. He only said, "Then wait and see what the desert does to the proud." The alien leader turned away and laughed with his people. But some of the younger aliens looked uneasy. They felt the wind press harder. They saw the horizon shift like a giant wave. Still, they stayed quiet. Their leader's pride was stronger than their fear. The sun was sinking lower. The desert sky turned red like blood. The air grew heavy, the sound of the wind louder. The wall of sand in the distance was rising higher. It looked alive, like a monster waking from sleep. The human walked back to his shelter. He checked the doors, sealed the edges, and prepared his people. He told them to wait inside, to stay calm, to breathe slow. He had done this before, many times. He knew what was coming. He knew the aliens were still outside. And soon they would learn. The aliens laughed one more time. They thought the storm was just a small wind. They thought the humans' warning was fear. They thought the shelter was a joke. But the desert was ready to prove them wrong. And the storm was almost here. The desert night was strange. It did not grow cooler. It only grew darker. The air still burned, but now the wind carried a low howl. It was not the sound of normal wind. It was the sound of something alive. The aliens sat under their glowing shields, laughing. They thought the storm would pass like a shadow. They thought the humans' warning was nothing but fear. But Captain Reed stood near his shelter. Watching the horizon, his eyes were fixed on the moving wall of sand. It was larger now, taller than mountains, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. The young aliens shifted uneasily in their seats. They felt the vibration under the sand. The ground trembled like the heartbeat of a giant. One whispered to another, "It feels wrong." But their leader silenced them with a sharp look. "We are not weaklings," he said. "This storm will break before us." His voice was strong, but deep inside, even he felt a flicker of doubt. Captain Reed finally spoke again. His voice was calm but heavy, carrying the weight of experience. "You do not understand this desert," he said. "This world does not forgive pride. It does not forgive mistakes. It eats them." The alien smirked, pretending not to hear, but the human walked closer, his boots sinking into the soft sand. He stopped before their shield, the storm's red light reflecting in his eyes. "I have seen men turned to bones in less than an hour," he said. "I have seen ships buried so deep, no one found them." Again, the desert does not care about your shields or your pride. It only waits, and it takes. The laughter faded a little. The aliens still smiled, but their voices grew quieter. One of them asked, "What makes your little box stronger than our shields?" Captain Reed placed his hand on the sand, feeling the pulse of the ground. "Because it is not about strength," he said. "It is about respect. Humans built the shelter to bow with the storm, not fight it." His words hung in the air like a shadow. The aliens exchanged glances, uneasy but still unwilling to admit fear. The wind roared louder. The glowing shields around their tents flickered. Dust and grains of sand pressed against the barrier, scratching like claws. The aliens lifted their heads, watching the storm climb higher. It was no longer just sand. It was lightning too. Bolts of white fire cut through the wall of dust, striking the desert floor. The sound was like mountains breaking apart. The younger aliens gasped, their eyes wide. Still, their leader rose to his full height, his golden scales flashing. "This is only wind and dust," he shouted. "We will not hide in a hole like animals." Captain Reed's voice grew sharp. Now, he no longer tried to persuade with patience. He pointed to the storm and said, "You are fools if you think this is just wind. That is a sandstorm born of fire. It will strip flesh from bone. It will tear steel apart. Your tents will fall. Your shields will choke, and your people will die." The aliens stared at him, their pride battling their fear. The leader laughed again, but the sound was forced. "You humans exaggerate," he said. "This desert cannot break us." But even as he spoke, the ground shook again, harder this time. The first wave of the storm had reached the edge of the camp. The shields glowed brighter, struggling against the pressure. Sand slammed into them like a million tiny blades. The air grew thick. The sound was deafening. Inside their tents, the aliens clutched their ears. Outside, the human shelter stood silent, its low shape cutting the wind, its walls groaning but holding. Captain Reed walked calmly to its door. He called back to the aliens one last time. "This is your last chance. Come inside or be buried in the desert." Some of the younger aliens rose to their feet. Their eyes darted between their leader and the raging storm. One shouted, "Commander, the shields will not hold." Another said, "We should listen to him." But the leader raised his arm, forcing them to stay. His pride was heavier than his fear. He shouted, "We will endure." We will not crawl into a hole made by a human." But his voice was drowned by the storm. The desert roared like a beast. Sand filled the sky, lightning tore the darkness, and the air turned red and violent. Captain Reed stepped into his shelter. The heavy door closed with a deep thud. Inside, his people waited in silence. They trusted him. They had seen this before. The human children huddled close. The adults checked supplies. The shelter was strong, low, and steady. It was not made to fight the storm. It was made to outlast it. And outside, the proud aliens were about to learn the difference. The storm hit full force. The shields cracked with light. Bending under the endless weight of sand, the aliens shouted, trying to keep order, but fear spread like fire. Some clung to the leader's words, others prayed to gods no longer listening. The desert did not care. It tore at their tents. It slammed against their shields. It screamed in their ears, and somewhere inside the storm, the aliens began to realize the truth. The human had not lied. The shelter they mocked was the only safe place in the desert. But now it might already be too late. The storm arrived like the roar of 1,000 beasts. It struck the alien camp without mercy. The first blast of wind bent their shining tents until the poles cracked. The glowing shields sparked as if lightning lived inside them. Sand cut through the air like blades, each grain sharp as glass. The aliens who laughed minutes before were now silent, their eyes wide with shock. The ground shook under their feet. Every step felt like standing on the back of something alive. The desert was not dead, it was awake, and it was angry. The storm screamed louder than their voices, drowning every command. The alien leader raised his arm, shouting orders, but the words vanished in the thunder of sand and wind. One of the younger aliens cried out as his tent tore free from its anchors. The glowing fabric flew into the storm and was gone in seconds. The energy shields flickered again, sparks leaping across the air. One alien touched the control panel, his claws moving fast. "Shields failing," he shouted. "Systems clogged. Sand is inside the circuits." His face was pale, his pride cracking with fear. The leader growled, refusing to show weakness. "Hold your ground," he shouted. "This storm will pass." But even he could feel it. The storm was not passing. It was growing stronger. Every second, the wall of sand grew taller. Lightning ripped across the sky, burning the air itself. The aliens huddled closer to their failing shields. And then, through the storm, they saw it, the human shelter, low and heavy. It stood against the wind. Sand crashed against it. Lightning lit its walls. But it did not break. It did not move. It did not fall. Inside, Captain Reed watched the storm calmly. He heard the roar like everyone else, but he felt safe. The shelter groaned, but it was built for this. Every stone, every bolt, every beam was made to bend and not break. The aliens looked at it with disbelief. "How is it still standing?" one shouted, his voice shaking. "Our shields are breaking, but that thing holds," the leader snarled. "Do not look at it. It is nothing but a hole in the ground." But even he could not stop his eyes from turning back again and again. The human shelter was alive, stronger than all their bright machines. The storm pushed harder. The shields cracked with loud snaps. Blue sparks burst into the air, blinding the aliens for a moment, and the first shield collapsed completely. Sand poured in like water, burying equipment, covering their food. The aliens screamed as the grains cut their skin. Some pulled their cloaks over their heads. Others pressed close to the last glowing shield. Fear was no longer silent. It was. Everywhere, one alien, younger than the rest, fell to his knees. "Commander, we will not survive this," he cried. The leader's golden scales flashed as he struck the ground with his claw. "We will endure," he said, his voice heavy with stubborn pride. But his words shook, and his eyes betrayed him. Even he was beginning to doubt. Captain Reed's voice echoed faintly from the storm. He had opened the shelter door for only a second. The light from inside cut through the storm like a beacon. "Come inside," he shouted, his words strong and sharp. "You will not last another hour out here." The aliens turned toward him, torn between pride and survival. Their leader growled, "Stay where you are." But his people no longer listened with the same faith. Another tent snapped free, vanishing into the storm. A second shield bent and cracked. The glow fading, sand swirled in thick waves. Striking like whips, aliens stumbled, clutching their eyes and ears. The storm was inside their lungs now, choking them. They coughed, spat blood, and looked again toward the human shelter. The leader raised his voice one last time. "Hold your ground. Do not bow to the human." But the storm answered louder than him. The last shield shrieked with sparks. A crack ran across its surface like lightning, and with a final burst of light, it shattered. Sand flooded the camp in a wild rush. Tents collapsed. Equipment vanished. The aliens screamed. Now there was no pride left, only fear. They looked at the shelter, their eyes desperate. Some staggered toward it, dragging their wounded. The leader shouted for them to stop, but his words were lost in the storm. The desert no longer cared for his pride. It swallowed his voice. It swallowed his camp. Only the human shelter still stood, a dark shape against the storm, and every alien knew the truth. If they did not enter that shelter soon, they would die where they stood, inside. Captain Reed closed the door again. He waited, listening to the storm crush everything outside. His people asked him, "Will they come?" He nodded slowly. "They will. When pride breaks, fear will lead them here." And he was right, because outside, the first signs of fear had already turned into desperation. The storm had begun its lesson, and the aliens were learning faster than they wanted to. The storm was no longer a storm. It was a living wall of death. The desert screamed with a voice that shattered bones. Sand ripped through the air like knives, each grain slicing skin and metal alike. Lightning carved the sky, striking the ground with fire that lit the darkness for seconds at a time. The alien camp was no longer a camp. It was wreckage, torn apart in moments. Tents twisted into the air and vanished. Metal poles snapped like dry sticks. Food, weapons, and tools were swallowed by the storm. The glowing machines sparked, short-circuited, and died under the flood of sand. Aliens screamed as the wind threw them into the ground. Their pride was gone. Their shields were gone. Their commander's voice was drowned forever in the roar. Inside the shelter, Captain Reed felt the walls tremble. The shelter groaned like an old beast, but it held. Every stone pressed harder against the storm. Every beam bent, but did not break. The children inside covered their ears, frightened by the sound. The adults sat close, their faces calm, trusting the captain. Reed stood near the door, listening, waiting, knowing what would come. Outside, the aliens tried to fight. Some raised their energy shields by hand, glowing blue domes in the sand. But the storm struck harder. Sand clogged the shields, sparks burned the air. One shield cracked and burst, throwing its owner into the sand. Another fell on his knees, his claws buried in the ground as the storm tore at his armor. Pride had no weight against the storm, and the storm showed no mercy. The alien leader roared, his golden scales glowing under the flashes of lightning. He fought to stand tall. To prove he was not afraid, he raised a weapon, firing into the storm as if he could kill it. The blast of energy vanished in the endless wall of dust. The storm swallowed the fire like it was nothing. The leader dropped to one knee, his weapon useless in his hands. His people looked at him with despair, their eyes full of betrayal. They had believed in his pride, and now that pride was killing them. "Shelter," one alien gasped, his voice almost lost in the storm. "Run to the shelter," another shouted, pulling at his injured comrade. The leader roared, "No, we will not bow to humans." But the words were weak, softer than the storm. No one listened anymore. The aliens stumbled, dragged, and crawled toward the low, dark shape in the sand, the human shelter. The very thing they mocked was now their only hope. Captain Reed heard the pounding on the door, voices shouting, claws scratching, bodies falling against the heavy steel. "Let us in," they cried. "Please, open the door." Reed stood in. Silence for a moment. His people watched him, fear in their eyes. One of them whispered, "Do we let them in?" Reed's face was hard, unreadable. "They mocked us. They called us weak, but the desert is teaching them now." He said, "Still, if we leave them, they will die." With a heavy breath, Reed pulled the lever. The door cracked open just enough for the light to spill into the storm. One by one, the aliens pushed inside, collapsing on the floor, gasping for air. Their scales were cut, their bodies bruised, their pride shattered. The storm had stripped them of everything. Except life, the leader was the last to enter. He stumbled, his golden scales covered in blood and sand. His eyes met Reed's filled with anger, shame, and something new, fear. The door slammed shut again. The shelter shook as the storm struck harder outside, but inside there was silence except for the sound of heavy breathing. The aliens lay on the floor, coughing, their bodies trembling. They looked around the shelter with wide eyes. They saw the thick walls, the clean air vents, the supplies stacked neatly. They saw humans sitting calmly, their children safe, their families steady. It was small, it was simple, but it was strong. The very thing they mocked was the only reason they were still alive. The leader staggered to his feet. He looked at Reed with narrowed eyes. This hole," he said, his voice shaking. "How can it survive what our technology could not?" Reed stood firm, his gaze locked on the alien commander. "Because it was not built with pride," he answered. "It was built with respect for the desert, for the storm, for survival." The words cut deeper than the sand. The aliens looked away, ashamed, but unable to deny the truth. Outside, the storm raged like the wrath of a god. The shelter trembled. Dust poured against its walls. But it held. The aliens sat in silence, hearing the roar, knowing what would have happened if they stayed outside. They closed their eyes, imagining their broken camp swallowed by the sand. For the first time, they felt small, weaker than the desert, weaker than the humans they mocked. Pride had been their weapon, but now it was nothing but dust. And the storm was far from over. Captain Reed walked among his people. He checked the doors, tightened the seals, and gave water to the frightened children. The aliens watched him in silence. This simple human, with no glowing armor, no great machines, had saved them, not with power, but with wisdom. The desert had proven him right, and it would continue to do so until the storm ended. For outside, the fight was still raging, and the desert was not done teaching its lesson. The shelter was full of heavy silence. Only the roar of the storm outside broke it. The walls trembled, the air vents rattled, the sand pressed endlessly against the steel. But inside, the humans sat steady. While the aliens gasped like drowning men, the storm had stolen their strength, their pride, their breath. Now, for the first time, they felt what humans had known all along. Captain Reed stood near the door, his arms crossed, his eyes calm but sharp. The aliens looked at him with faces filled with shame. They had mocked him, mocked his people, mocked his shelter, and yet here they were, alive only because he opened the door. The golden-scaled leader tried to lift his head. His eyes burned with anger, but his body trembled. He wanted to speak, but his pride choked the words in his throat. One of the younger aliens broke the silence. His voice was weak, almost a whisper. "We would have died," he said, staring at the ground. Reed nodded once, his face unreadable. "Yes, you would," he replied, his voice like a blade. The alien swallowed hard, his claws digging into the floor. Another alien spoke, louder this time. Our shields are gone. Our camp is gone. What do we do now? His eyes darted to the human supplies, stacked neatly against the wall. Water containers, sealed food, oxygen filters, simple tools, nothing grand, but everything necessary. The leader snarled at his own people. Do not beg from them, he growled, though his voice cracked. We are warriors. We will endure without. They're scraps, but the storm roared louder outside, shaking the very floor. The aliens shivered, pulling closer to the humans without even realizing it. Their commander's words were empty now. Pride had no weight against death. Captain Reed stepped forward. He looked directly at the leader, his gaze steady. You think this shelter is weakness, Reed said, but weakness is not knowing when to bow to the storm. The leader's jaw tightened, his golden scales catching the faint light. His pride screamed inside him, but his people's eyes were begging him to stop. For the first time, he felt the cracks, not in the walls of the shelter, but in his command. The storm struck again, harder than before. A sound like thunder shook the shelter, dust pouring through the vents. The walls groaned, the floor shivered. The humans stayed calm, adjusting seals, checking supports, but the aliens panicked, their claws scraping against the floor. They shouted in fear, convinced the shelter would collapse. One alien screamed, "It will bury us. We are trapped." Another clawed at the door as if to escape, though there was nowhere to go. Reed barked, his voice strong. Sit down, stay calm. The shelter holds. His command cut through their panic like a knife. Even the aliens froze, stunned by the strength in his voice. The leader staggered to his feet. He wanted to roar, to remind his people he was still their commander. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. The storm outside spoke louder than he ever could. His golden scales shook, his pride shattered with every tremor of the shelter. And deep inside, he knew Reed was right. Without the humans, they were nothing here. Hours passed like this, each one longer than the last. The storm gave no mercy, no rest, no silence. The aliens grew weaker, their throats dry, their eyes heavy, their bodies shaking. The humans shared water with them, quiet and calm. At first the aliens refused, their pride whispering, "Do not take it." But thirst was stronger than pride. One by one they accepted the water, drinking deeply. The leader turned away, ashamed. But even he could not stop his hand from reaching out at last. Captain Reed watched all of this without a word. He knew the storm was teaching them better than he ever could. It was stripping them down, cutting them open, showing them what survival meant. It was not about power, not about pride, not about bright shields or tall tents. It was about respect, planning, patience, and endurance. Things humans had learned the hard way on countless worlds. Things these proud aliens were only learning. Now, when the next strike of thunder hit, the shelter shook so violently, the lights flickered, the aliens cried out, some clinging to the walls, others falling to the floor. The leader's eyes went wide. His pride finally breaking into fear, he shouted, "Human, will it hold?" His voice desperate now. Reed looked at him steadily. "Yes, it will hold," he said, "because it was built for this, not to impress, but to survive." The leader sank to his knees, his body trembling. He whispered, "We mocked you, and now we depend on you." The words tasted like poison in his mouth, but he could not stop them. The aliens were silent after that. They sat in the shelter, listening to the storm devour their camp. They thought of their shining shields, their tall tents, their proud weapons, all destroyed in moments by sand and wind. They thought of the little shelter, the thing they laughed at, still standing, still protecting, still proving them wrong. Desperation had stripped them bare, and for the first time, they looked at humans not as weak creatures, But as survivors, Captain Reed closed his eyes. He could feel the storm's rage outside, endless and merciless. But inside, he knew the lesson was nearly complete. The aliens had reached the breaking point, and when the storm ended, they would never look at humans the same again. The desert had taken their pride and left only truth behind. The storm howled outside like a beast that would never grow tired. Every strike of wind shook the shelter. Every roar of thunder pressed against the walls. But inside, there was calm, not silence, but calm. The humans moved with purpose, checking vents, adjusting seals, handing out water. They had done this many times before, and their steady actions filled the room with quiet strength. The aliens, however, sat in shock, staring at everything around them. The shelter was not large, not tall, not impressive. It was small, low, and built close to the ground. Its walls were thick, layered with stone, steel, and hardened sand. Pipes ran across the ceiling, carrying filtered air into every corner. The floor was firm, bolted with anchors deep into the earth. It was not a palace, not a fortress, but it was unshakable. The aliens whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. "How can this small place stand against such a storm?" One asked. "It bends, but it does not break." Another replied. They touched the walls, feeling the vibration. It was alive. It breathed with the storm, but it did not fall. For the first time, they began to understand. In one corner, a group of human children sat quietly. They held small lamps, their faces calm despite the roar outside. A human mother gave them water, smiling gently. The aliens stared at them in disbelief. "How are they not afraid?" one whispered. "They have seen this before," Reed answered from the shadows. "They know the shelter holds. They trust it, and they trust us." The leader of the aliens clenched his fists. His golden scales were scratched, his body bruised, his pride shattered. He looked around at the humans with new eyes. They were not weak. They were not foolish. They were survivors. He hated the thought, but he could not deny it anymore. He muttered, "We thought you hid because you were weak, but you hide because you are strong." Reed stepped closer, his voice calm but sharp. "You mistake survival for weakness," he said. "Your pride blinded you. You build to impress the stars. We build to endure the storm." The leader did not answer, his jaw tight, his pride burning like an open wound. But the truth was carved deep into him now. Every sound of the storm outside drove it deeper. The aliens began to notice more. They saw the supplies stacked with care, containers of water sealed against the sand, food rations simple, but enough to last for weeks, medical kits, oxygen tanks, spare tools, every detail planned. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. The shelter was not beautiful, but it was perfect. Perfect for survival, perfect for defying the desert's wrath. One alien touched a vent and whispered, "The air is fresh." Another picked up a ration pack. "The food will last long." They turned their eyes toward their leader, their faces questioning. He lowered his gaze, unable to speak. They had followed his pride, and it had nearly killed them. Now they were alive only because of the humans. The shame weighed on him heavier than the storm. Reed watched him in silence. He did not mock. He did not smile. He only waited. The storm was teaching them, and he would not interrupt its lesson. Minutes turned into hours, the storm never resting. Yet inside, the shelter stood strong. The aliens realized they were safe, safer than they had ever been under their glowing shields. But safety did not erase the fear. Every tremor of the walls reminded them how fragile life truly was. Every roar of the storm made them imagine what lay outside. Their proud camp buried, their weapons useless, their tents torn apart. The images haunted them, and they clung closer to the humans. Some prayed, some sat silent, some wept, but all of them knew the truth. Without this shelter, they would be bones in the sand, The leader finally spoke, his voice low, broken. "I was wrong," he said, the words heavy like stones. His people turned to him in shock. He had never spoken such words before. Reed looked at him, his face calm. "The desert broke your pride." "Not me," he said. "But if you learn, then the storm has done its job." The aliens lowered their heads. Their pride had kept them blind, but now their eyes were open. They saw humans not as weaklings, but as masters of survival. They saw the shelter not as a joke, but as salvation. Every wall, every beam, every supply told the same story. Humans did not conquer the desert with power. They endured it with patience, with design, with respect. Outside, the storm continued to roar. The walls shook, the vents rattled, the ground trembled. But inside, something stronger than the storm had been born. Respect. The aliens sat quietly, their eyes on the humans. They would never laugh at their shelters again. Not after this night, not after this storm. Reed turned away, closing his eyes. The desert had taught its lesson, but it was not finished yet. The storm still raged, and when it ended, the aliens would face a world changed forever. A world where only one shelter still stood, and they would never forget which one it was. The storm raged through the endless night. Hours passed like lifetimes, every roar of the desert tearing at the walls. Inside the shelter, the humans waited. In silence, their hearts steady, the aliens sat among them, their bodies bruised, their pride broken, their eyes hollow. They listened to the storm devour everything they once trusted, and each moment made them understand more. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the sound began to change. The roar softened to a growl, the growl to a whisper, the trembling of the walls slowed, the vents stopped rattling. The storm, mighty and merciless, was dying. Captain Reed opened his eyes, his hand still resting on the steel door. "It is ending," he said, his voice calm. The aliens lifted their heads in disbelief. They could not imagine the desert growing silent again. But slowly they realized it was true for the first time. In days, there was silence outside. No roar, no thunder, no endless scream of sand. Only a deep stillness, heavy and strange. The humans began to prepare. Checking their packs and sealing their supplies, Reed gave the order. "We open when the light returns." The aliens stared at him, confused. "Why wait? The storm has stopped," one asked. Reed shook his head, his eyes sharp. "The desert is full of tricks. A storm may strike again without warning." The aliens lowered their gaze, ashamed at their impatience. They had already learned not to doubt him. When the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, Reed moved to the door. He pulled the lever, and with a heavy groan, the shelter opened. A blast of hot, dry air rushed in, carrying the bitter smell of sand and ash. The aliens shielded their eyes as they stepped outside, and what they saw made their hearts sink into silence. There, camp was gone, not broken, not damaged, but erased. The shining tents were buried under mountains of sand. The glowing shields lay shattered, their frames twisted and burned. Weapons, food, machines all swallowed without a trace. The desert had taken everything. Only a flat wasteland stretched where their proud camp once stood. They turned there. Eyes to the human shelter. It still stood, low and dark against the golden light of dawn. The sand had piled high around its walls, but it had not fallen. It had endured the storm, just as Reed promised. The aliens were silent, their eyes wide, their mouths closed. No words could describe what they felt. Shame, awe, fear, and respect all tangled inside them. The golden-scaled leader fell to his knees. His claws dug into the sand as he lowered his head. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "We mocked you, we doubted you, and we would be dead without you." He lifted his eyes to Reed. His pride shattered into dust. "From this day, we will never call human shelters weak again." The other aliens followed. Bowing their heads, they had seen the truth with their own eyes. Their shields failed, their tents broke, their weapons vanished. But the human shelter had stood against the storm. They could not deny it. They could not laugh any more. Respect had replaced pride, and it was heavy in their hearts. Reed stood tall, his face steady. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply said, "The desert teaches better than I ever could." His people stood behind him, calm and quiet. The children looked at the aliens with wide eyes. The mothers and fathers watched in silence. They had seen this lesson before, on other worlds, in other storms, and they knew it would be seen again. The leader of the aliens rose to his feet, his golden scales no longer shining with pride, but dulled with humility. He placed his clawed hand against the shelter wall. "This small box is stronger than all we built," he said. Reed shook his head. "It is not the box, it is the hands that built it, the minds that designed it, the patience that shaped it." The alien nodded slowly, his eyes dark with understanding. "We thought you weak, but you are stronger than we imagined. Not with weapons, but with survival." The desert lay silent around them, the sky clear, the sun rising, the world washed clean. But where once a proud alien camp stood, there was nothing but emptiness, and beside it, the human shelter still stood, defiant and unbroken. It was more than stone and steel now. It was a symbol, carved into the hearts of everyone who saw it. A symbol of endurance, of humility, of respect. The aliens would tell this story again and again, of the night they laughed at a human shelter, of the storm that came like fire and death, of how their pride shattered and how the shelter saved them. And with each telling, they would lower their voices, for they would never forget the lesson of the desert. Captain Reed turned away from the ruins. He gave one final look to the endless sands. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of truth. "Out here, it does not matter who you are, alien or human, strong or weak, proud or humble," he said. "The desert will take the proud and leave only the survivors." And with that, he stepped back into the shelter. The aliens followed, silent, respectful, and forever changed. From that day, they never laughed at human shelters again.